Hello everybody, thank you for watching. I'm Roger, and in this video we are going to go over root position part writing in 4 voices when our chordal roots move by third. In this example I have a G chord moving down a third to an E chord, and I prolong the example a little bit to continue from a 6 chord to a 4 chord, which is also down a third. The chordal root of this G chord would be, well, guess what, a G. And the chordal root of the 6 chord would be an E. So E is down a third from G, and then if we continue from our 6 chord to our 4 chord, the chordal root of the 4 chord in this key is C. So E down to C is another third. Again, the same voice leading principles would apply if I had a progression that was moving up a third. The chordal roots were moving up a third, although that is far less common than what you see here, the descending thirds progression that I am doing right now. So if you remember from that first video I did on root position part writing, there are 2 common tones that are possible when our chordal root relationships are a third apart like this. But let's break that down for a moment, okay? So in this G chord, we're going to have what notes? We're going to have G, B, and D, right? And then if we move to this E chord, which we will, we are going to have an E, a G, and a B, right? So as we can see here, these 2 chords will have the G in common and the B in common. And this is going to be very helpful when we do this voice leading, because a lot of the motion we're trying to avoid, right, over here are these parallel perfect octaves, perfect fifths, and perfect unisons. Gosh, I need that. There it is, perfect fifths as well. So a lot of the motion we're trying to avoid, the parallel perfect octaves, unisons, and fifths, are not going to be an issue if we retain the common tones between 2 chords in the same voices. So the common tones in this example are G and B. I want to retain those common tones in the same voice. The obsession with common tones is a little overdone, especially when we get into triads and first inversion and other idioms. We're going to find that keeping the common tone isn't always the best idea, but for right now, common tones are absolutely going to be your friend. But just don't hold on to that too tightly, because like I said, sometimes it will set you up for mistakes as you get into more advanced material. Okay, so back to the common tones and keeping them in the same voice. That keeping them in the same voice is key, is important, right? So the G, which is in the alto, keeping that G in the same voice would mean to literally keep the G in the alto voice. All right? And the B, which is the other common tone, being sung or appearing in the soprano, would remain in the soprano voice. That's what it means. That's what it means to keep the common tone in the same voice. So if we do that, we're pretty much done here, right? We've got a complete E triad, E, G, and B. All that's missing is that doubled chordal root, right? So it stands to reason that the tenor voice would just move up a step to that E. Now what keeping common tones in the same voice does is that it really helps eliminate the parallel octaves and unisons and fifths when chordal roots move by second in the earlier video, right? We saw a lot of potential issues there. But when we keep common tones in the same voice, inherent to that is that they're not going to move to another note. And so if they're not going to move, then we've eliminated really that parallel motion issue because, well, they're not going to move. All right? Now, one thing I sometimes see is my students will do things like this, at first anyways. And of course, there are some issues with this on a number of levels. We have parallel perfect fifths and parallel perfect octaves, parallel perfect fifths between the bass and tenor voices, and parallel octaves between the bass and alto. But the reason why I'm really putting this up on the board as an example of what not to do is because sometimes that common tone in the same voice doesn't get processed completely, doesn't get, sometimes that common tone in the same voice can be confused a little bit, because as you can see here, this G is still being sung, but just by another voice, right? So sometimes my students will see that, okay, this G, keeping that common tone, well, I've kept it. They'll think they've kept it, and it's actually understandable, right? It is the same G, right? But it's not being sung or performed it's not appearing in the same voice, right? This G is in the alto voice, and this G, while the same pitch, the same note, is not in the alto voice. It's in the soprano voice. And so when we're talking about retaining common tones, it's important to remember that we're talking about keeping them in that same voice. In this case, the alto and the soprano. And that will help us avoid those parallel issues. Now, if we continue this progression onto our 4 chord, the same principles would apply. In this 4 chord, which is a C chord, the notes are going to be C, E, and G. So the common tones are going to be E and G. Again, we have those 2 possible common tones when we have chordal roots that are a third apart. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to retain those common tones in the same voice. Let's start with the E. Well, we have an E in this 6th chord, right? It's in the tenor voice. We want to keep it in that tenor voice. And then we have a G common tone. In the 6th chord, it's appearing in the alto voice. We want to keep it in that alto voice. And then finally, we have one more voice, the soprano in this particular case. What should it do? Well, we have a complete triad already, C, E, and G. And what do we need to double? The C, the chordal root of the 4 chord. So that soprano can just move up by step, and we've got a complete triad. We've got doubled chordal roots. Everything is great. Again, chordal root motion by second is actually pretty straightforward, and so is chordal root motion by third. We don't have to overcomplicate our lives. It's the next root relationship, that third category, chordal root motion by fourth, where things can be more nuanced. But I'm going to discuss that in the next video. Thank you very much for watching, and if you want to, please subscribe.